Good morning. My name is Gary Cooney. I'm your Bible teacher. Thank you for joining me today in my pastoral study as we gather together for another of our Wednesdays in the Word. We've been in the midst of an extended study in the book of Daniel. I hope that you've been following along. If you've not been, I encourage you to go back and listen to some of the previous sessions. We're now in the second chapter of the book of Daniel. I want to pick up our reading today in verse 12 of Daniel chapter 2. So take a moment, open your scriptures, I hope you have them with you, and follow along with me as I read some of that second chapter, and we'll study it together. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and he commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. And so the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. But then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill all of the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" And then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. And then Daniel went to his house, and he made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he told them to seek the mercy from the Lord and the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. And Daniel praised the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belongs wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I will give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we ask of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter." All right. If you've been with me, you know that in chapter 2, we encounter a second and critical crisis that we're facing Daniel's life. Chapter 1, the crisis of being carried off as a young teenager to Babylon, forced into a 3-year program of administrative preparation to serve the king of the enemy. We saw how God guided him and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego through that process. And they came out the other side in a God-honoring way, 10 times better in their oral exams than they were initiated at that point in time by Nebuchadnezzar into the order of the Magi, the think tank of the day. Chapter 2, beginning shortly after that time, say a year to 2 years, at that particular point in time, yet another crisis arose. And the crisis was related to a dream that God sent to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Neo-Chaldean Empire. It was a dream that the king found exceedingly unsettling. We've talked already about the nature of that king, Nebuchadnezzar, his pride, his personal capabilities, the wonder of his kingdom. He sensed very quickly that this dream was not a normal dream for him. And in some sense, and we don't understand exactly how, but God did it, he helped Nebuchadnezzar to understand that this dream had something to do with the future of his kingdom. In other words, what would be affecting his descendants as well as he himself. And because of that, the dream unsettled him, and he was desperate to get an answer. He needed an interpretation. The normal procedure, if you're desperate for input in that era, was to go to your think tank, that group of advisors who were sharp, knowledgeable, had skills in different areas, and look for information from them. Not so different from today's government structures. The Magi were the think tank of the day. And so he summoned the leadership of the Magi, the people who were at the very peak of the pyramid as far as capability were concerned and administrative responsibility. And he said, "Listen, I need you to interpret this dream." And if you interpret it correctly, accurately, I will give you untold honors. If you don't interpret it properly, I will kill you and horribly kill you. And we talk some about the nature of the capital punishment process in Babylon. And I will also destroy your family and your livelihood. The Magi said, okay, we understand the seriousness. Tell us the dream, and we will interpret it for you. And the king said, no, I'm not going to tell you the dream. Part of what I want from you is to give me the picture of the dream. If you can tell me what the dream was, then I'll give you permission to tell me what it means. But I won't tell you the dream to begin with. The king, I believe, prompted by God, had put up what was essentially an impossible barrier for anyone who could know what a dream was if they weren't told about the dream. At any rate, the Magi said, nobody can do this. The only one who could do it would be God, and God doesn't interact with humanity any longer. How wrong they were, right? That was the whole point of the book of Daniel. At any rate, the Magi failed, and in his frustration, and that's where we picked up the story in my reading to you today, his fury, his anger, he commands that his warning of a death penalty and a destruction of the households would actually be implemented. And as a result of that, it wasn't just the leadership of the Magi, but everyone who was incorporated into the Magi order would be under death sentence. And that included 4 young men, late teenagers, I think, in the chronology of these events, maybe 18, 19, possibly 20, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They faced execution along with the rest. And so that's where the story picks up, this terrible crisis. And I want today, in these verses that I read to you, to look at how Daniel began to respond to this impossible situation, the impossible demand that was placed on the Magi order by the king. How did he do this? And in looking at it, I believe we'll gain some insight, some principles about responding to impossible situations in our lives. So let's look at it. Clearly, as Daniel gets the message, he had to remind himself of something that I'm sure he was reminding himself about over the last number of years of his life, from the time he was carried off into exile as a young teenager, all through the training period, and then in this first part of his service of the king in the Magi order, and it was this, that nothing is impossible for the God who is really there. He needed to remind himself of that because otherwise, in terrible life circumstances that might arise, the tendency would be to fall apart, go crazy, run around, and scurry around with no rhyme or reason because of the disaster that looms above you. Daniel didn't fall apart. He didn't give in to despair. He didn't freeze up in the face of what seemed to be an impossible circumstance. I was thinking how similar this is to Mary, the mother of the Lord Jesus. As in Luke chapter 2, she receives this remarkable message from the angel Gabriel that she is going to be the mother of a child that will be miraculously conceived within her, and that this child would be the very Son of God. And as she looks at that and sees her own condition and knows she's not been with a man and all of this, she responds in this, verse 37, after being reminded by God through Gabriel that nothing is impossible with God, Mary responds and says, "Behold, I'm the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your will." And the angel departed from her. We need to remind ourselves that nothing is impossible with God. Our impossible circumstances are only impossible as they're viewed from a human vantage point. God, who masterminds history and therefore masterminds our lives, has purposes involved in everything that he permits to come into our lives, and therefore no circumstance arises that's impossible, i.e., impossible to be resolved in a way that glorifies God. We don't know necessarily ahead of time what that way of resolving it's going to be, but it will come and it will be evident. And at times, the resolving of it can lead to escape, other times not necessarily so. But it's not because it's an impossible situation, but because we're determined to do the will of the Lord in the midst of it. You and I will all face impossible situations. I'm sure all of you listening to me know exactly what that feels like, because it's the rare person who hasn't encountered seemingly impossible circumstances and situations. Keep reminding yourself is step number one, just like Daniel must have. Nothing's impossible with God. Nothing's outside of his control. And in some way, he has permitted the very circumstances that seem impossible to me. He has permitted them. And therefore, he is greater than those circumstances. Apply that to your own difficult circumstances. Nothing is impossible with God. The second thing I think that you see unfolding in these verses that I read to you today is that Daniel avoided falling into the blame game. I'll call it that at any rate. I don't detect any blaming going on here on the part of Daniel. In other words, let me frame it this way. I don't see Daniel saying, oh, great, what a bunch of losers we have as the head of our Magi order. Look what mess they've gotten us into. I don't see any blaming going on. I think Daniel understood very plainly God was creating the impossible situation. It wouldn't matter who was the head of the Magi order. It wasn't failure on the part of the Magi order, or for that matter, even failure on the part of the king, that gave rise to the serious situation they were in. God was using it and creating it, and therefore was the master of it. Why is that important? Because it is easy to blame people for the problems God permits to come into our lives. And therefore, whenever we fall into that trap, we end up not necessarily as successful in preventing ourselves from reacting to people with bitterness, judgmentalism, and that serves no purpose at all. Don't waste time blaming people for the circumstance you're finding in, even though people have a role. But step back, not only tell yourself nothing's impossible with God, but also tell yourself nothing happens to me except by the permissive will of God. And God's purposes will finally be revealed here in this situation. Daniel knew nothing happens in his life. Not a pretty remarkable thing for us to understand at any time in our Christian life. Daniel was yet a young man, perhaps a late teenager, early 20. What great perception. He didn't blame anybody for the circumstance he was in. He understood who, on the human level, was responsible for the decisions, but he wasn't blaming anyone. So begin your impossible circumstance by reminding yourself nothing's impossible for God. He is superintending things. And don't fall into the trap of blaming people, blaming circumstances for your problem. There are certainly people who are involved, and certainly circumstances can have some influence. But ultimately, your circumstance, your situation, your impossible problem is due to God's permissive will in the midst of it. So there we are. Remind yourself nothing's impossible with God. Don't fall into the blame game. Keep reminding yourself God is ultimately responsible for permitting this to enter into my life. Beginning in verse 14 and 15, he says, Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill all the wise men, and he declared to him, Why is this decree so urgent? And Arioch made the matter known to him. Step number 3, after you've reminded yourself of these foundational issues that nothing's impossible for God, then don't start blaming people. Trust God's purpose in the midst of the circumstance you're in. Then get more information about the circumstance. Try to get an answer as to the why of things. What's led to this situation? Why did this happen? Why was this particular decision being made? Now, in some cases, we may seek for such answers and we may not find them. We may not be able to discover such things, but we should always seek for it and question and figure out why. Daniel sought to find out why from Arioch, who is the captain of the guard. Arioch, as the captain of the guard, was the one implementing the decision of the king. In other words, he was the one who was doing the killing, not the king. And so you go to him and you say, Arioch, why? I need some information. Daniel sought enough information to clarify the problem. Daniel understood and was prompted by God, certainly, about this. Make sure you know the real issues driving the crisis. Get as much fact as you can. Ask the whys that need to be asked to try to get a background on the issue. Without the whys, without seeking information, you have no way to really act appropriately in light of this difficult and impossible circumstance that you may be facing. Find the whys. And when you're going about trying to find the why, notice how Daniel spoke to this king, this captain of the king, who was going to implement the killing of all of the Magi, including himself. He spoke to Arioch, it says in the ESV, with prudence and discretion. The King James Version says he spoke with counsel and wisdom. The New American Standard Version says with discretion and discernment. In other words, don't compound the problem as you're seeking more information about it by your response to the people you're seeking information from. The NIV translates those two words by these words, wisdom and tact. Use tact, use discretion, prudence. Find the information, but find it in a way that doesn't aggravate the problem. Verbal sin never helps, even though at times in your frustration, you may feel somewhat justified in allowing yourself to roll at the mouth a bit and be accusatory of people. And God says, no, don't do that. Don't fall into that trap. Speak with prudence and discretion as you're seeking to gain information about your own impossible circumstance. Verbal sin never helps us. I was thinking of Proverbs 15:1. It says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. You don't need to have stirring up of anger in your impossible circumstances. Certainly Daniel didn't. He wasn't trying to make the captain angry and therefore more happy to kill him than ever. He wanted to lessen the intensity of the problem, to turn away wrath to whatever degree he could. Proverbs 15:28 says, the heart of the righteous ponders, and the mind of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked just spews out evil things. It makes a difference what you say. So as you seek for the information that clearly is part of crisis resolution, seek after it with tact, with discretion, with prudence. Get the information and get it in a way that is not aggravating the problem. And certainly you're gaining all of that information as a protection against jumping to conclusions without knowing the facts of the circumstance. Clearly, if you follow the chronology of these verses that I read to you today, it was only after Daniel got information from Arioch. It was only after he had clarification of what's this problem? Where did this death sentence come from? What's really the problem that the king is facing? What was it about the Magi that angered the king to such a degree that he was going to implement such a terrible decree? Get the information. And once he got all of that information, then with his friends, he began to develop a plan to solve it. We waste too much energy, too much time, if we don't first grasp what the real problem is. We have to know the real problem before we begin to expend the energy to seek to resolve the problem. By the way, that issue, not jumping to conclusions and organizing a plan before you really know the facts, is used in common life all the time. I think about consulting in business. How do you help a business get the facts? Figure out what the real problem is. Don't assume. It's critical for counseling. It's critical in all of our personal decisions. Make sure you get all the facts. Ask yourself, do I really know what's going on? Don't assume. Investigate. There should be. Write that out on a 3x card for yourself. Put it on your mirror sometimes. Don't assume. Investigate. Ask the questions. And by the way, as you're asking the questions, ask them with prudence and discretion, as we see going on in this situation. All right. Get more information as best you can. The next thing you see in verse 16, he says, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation. Daniel said, all right, in light of all of this, we're praying, I'm going to look at these things. I am going to look for a time. I'm going to seek to buy time, in other words. Get a set time in which I'm going to respond. So the implication, by the way, in the way the passage is unfolding in chapter 2, is that Daniel asked Arioch, the king, to arrange an audience with the king. You see, in that era of history, nobody could simply barge into the king's presence. That was a death sentence in itself. Daniel needed an authority figure to request the king's permission to actually have a slot in the schedule, a time to come in. And so he was asking Arioch to do this. Arioch, remember, gave him the information of what the problem was. And so essentially what Daniel is saying, set up a time so that I can explain what the Magi couldn't explain. And Arioch was an astute enough leader, and he had to be able to be in the position of being a captain. He was astute enough to understand what the king really wanted was an answer. And if Daniel had the possibility of providing an answer, that's what the king was after anyway. And so Daniel said, listen, set up a time. Give me, by so doing, a brief stay of execution, I guess. Don't implement the execution immediately for me or by definition for any of the other Magi order. Buy some time. And in the time that was purchased, he spent time in prayer, and he had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego spend time in prayer. We need God, the one who can do the impossible, to give us the impossible answer. And so, give us a time. Give us the appointment. There's the deadline. Time was needed, by the way, because it was an interpretive question. There was the answer that the king was seeking was not a simple yes or no. You wouldn't have needed much appointment if it was either yes or no. What you needed was time for the interpretation, time to show you knew the dream, and then time to explain what the dream meant. And the king was desperate for an answer. That's been the whole backdrop to the second chapter. And because he was desperate for an answer, the possibility that he could get one from someone with whom he was already favorably remembering. He had not forgotten that particular one who appeared before him 10 times better than all of the others in the 3-year training program. Because he was desperate, he thought, maybe, possibly, maybe this one can do what the other leadership couldn't do. And so he was willing to grant the stay of execution, essentially, and give him a slot to begin to come in and share. And by the way, the slots of life are important. We don't just ask God for an indefinite stay. When we're asking God to help us in an impossible circumstance, usually we should be targeting a particular time, set up the appointment. In other words, Lord, I'm not putting off making a decision about something, but help me to have a little time to pray and get guidance about it. Do you follow the point? You don't just ask God to make it so you don't have to deal with the problem, but take the time to get clear direction from God about it. Here's the key. Don't be in too much of a hurry to resolve the impossible circumstances of your life. Many crises that arise that are seemingly impossible to us actually have more leeway in them, timing at least wise, than we at first think they do. What often happens for us as we face an impossible situation, a terrible crisis, a disastrous circumstance, is we want to have a premature ending of it. We're tempted to want to take a premature action. We'll do anything simply to stop the stress of the impossible circumstance. And understand that temptation's not only strong temptation, but a disastrous one at times, because the anything that we may try to be tempted to do just to stop the stress may be the very thing that makes it impossible to solve the situation. So God says, I want you to be willing to live under stress in these, quote, impossible situations until I've given you clear guidance on the right path to take to resolve the crisis and resolve it in a way that honors me. In Daniel's case, that waiting, he had no way of knowing quite how long that waiting was going to take, but that waiting was only one day, at least in this situation. Many other situations in Scripture, the waiting is much longer than that. But he was willing to wait until God gave the clear guidance. All right, do you see it? Remind yourself nothing's impossible with God. Don't fall into the blame game. God's permitting the circumstance ultimately. Get more information as much as you can about the circumstance. Make sure you know the real problem. And get that information interacting with other people in a way that's full of prudence and discretion. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't make assumptions. Investigate. And then seek time to be clear about God's guidance and direction. Well, much more to say about how God was going about solving this issue and using Daniel to achieve the purpose driving it in the first place. Join me in our next time together as we continue in chapter 2 and investigate more of this impossible demand. God bless.